Welcome to Reformed Thinking. We are genuinely thrilled to have you sitting down with us for this deep dive today. Today we are taking a really close, meticulous look at a classic piece of theological writing. We're going to take our time unpacking it because it requires that kind of attention. The mission for our conversation today is to examine John Owen's theological masterwork, a dissertation on divine justice. And we are specifically locking our focus onto chapter 2. This is a text that, it demands your full attention. It tackles a core question regarding the very nature of God and the actual mechanics of salvation. So, here is the central theological puzzle we are putting on the table for you today. If God decides to forgive a sinner, could he just let the sin slide without inflicting a penalty?
That is the big question, yes.
Right. Could the Almighty simply declare a person forgiven by a sheer act of his will, bypassing any need for punishment whatsoever? Or does his very nature, his intrinsic holiness, demand that sin must be punished? We are asking whether punishing sin is a free choice God makes or an absolute necessity of who he is.
That is the precise question John Owen is attempting to answer in this text. And it is not just some dry academic exercise for theologians in an ivory tower.
Not at all. And the reason this theological distinction matters to your faith is staggering. We are framing this entire discussion around the cross of Jesus Christ. If you think about it this way, if punishing sin is just a free choice God makes, rather than an absolute necessity of his holy nature, the entire reason for Christ's sacrifice shifts dramatically.
It shifts in a way that is actually quite dangerous to the Christian faith.
Yes, because if God could have just waved away our guilt without a penalty, then the agonizing death of the Son of God was not strictly required. It becomes an option, rather than the singular, necessary mechanism for your salvation. We want to bring you into the theological trenches with John Owen today to see why getting this right anchors your entire understanding of the gospel.
When you read John Owen, you're dealing with a mind that he just refuses to let logical inconsistencies stand, especially when those inconsistencies threaten the glory of Christ's atonement. Owen starts this chapter by clearing the brush, so to speak. He initiates a severe critique of the Schoolmen. To give you some historical context here, the Schoolmen were the Scholastic theologians of the medieval period. We are talking about prominent figures like Duns Scotus, Durandus, Thomas Aquinas, and Cajetan. These men spent an immense amount of time engaging in philosophical debates about what they called commutative justice.
Let's pause right there for a second. Commutative justice is not a phrase most of us toss around in our daily lives. Can you break down what that actually means in plain English for everyone listening?
I can certainly do that. Commutative justice is basically the justice of equal exchange. It is the principle that governs our business transactions and our contracts. You give me something of value, and I give you something of equal value in return. If you go to the store and buy a loaf of bread, you hand the cashier $3 and they hand you the bread. The exchange is equal. The Schoolmen were debating whether this kind of justice exists in God. Owen points out that they are strangely divided on this issue, but he focuses his attention on the arguments of Durandus. Now, Durandus actually got this part right. He contended that commutative justice cannot be assigned to God. He argued this because commutative justice requires strict equality between what is given and what is received. Between finite humans and an infinite God, such equality is literally impossible.
That makes intuitive sense to anyone who thinks about it for a minute. We are finite creatures. But Owen does not just rely on human logic here, does he? He brings in the scriptures to seal this point.
He absolutely does. Owen leans on three specific scriptures to dismantle the idea of an equal exchange with God. First, he cites Romans chapter 11, verse 35. The Apostle Paul asks, "Who has first given to him, and it shall be recompensed unto him again."
And the context of Romans 11 is massive. Paul is wrapping up this sweeping argument about God's sovereign election and mercy. He is looking at the sheer magnitude of God's wisdom and essentially asking the reader, who could possibly put God in their debt? The rhetorical answer is, obviously, no one.
No one gives to God first. God is the initiator of all things. Then Owen points to Job chapter 22, verse 3. The question asked there by Eliphaz is whether it is any gain to God that you make your ways perfect.
That is such a fascinating verse. Even if we could somehow live a perfectly blameless life, which we know we cannot, it still would not add anything to God. It would not increase his value or his happiness one bit.
Right, because God is perfectly complete in himself. Finally, Owen references Luke chapter 17, verse 10. In this passage, Jesus declares that even when we have done all that is commanded, we are to say, "We are unprofitable servants. We have done that which was our duty to do."
That verse just crushes human pride. Even our absolute best obedience is just doing what we were already obligated to do. We are not doing God a favor by obeying
The
him.
logic Owen builds from these scriptures is airtight. You and I cannot be of any service to God that creates a debt on his end. This brings up a vital theological term we need to define for this conversation, which is aseity. God possesses perfect aseity.
Let's use the explain it like I am five approach for that word. What does aseity actually mean for the listener who has not been to seminary?
Aseity means that God is entirely self-sufficient. He is self-existent. He does not need anything outside of himself to exist, to be happy, or to be complete. He's a closed loop of perfection. Therefore, the idea that we could offer him something of value that obligates him to repay us with salvation or grace is a philosophical absurdity. He already owns everything.
That concept of aseity is so clarifying. It really exposes the arrogance of thinking we can barter with the Creator. To help visualize the absurdity of commutative justice between man and God, think of an analogy involving a toddler and a parent. Imagine a toddler walking up to their mother or father, holding a handful of brightly colored Monopoly money and earnestly trying to pay the monthly mortgage. The parent provides the house, the warmth, the food, and the safety. The toddler, wanting to make an equal exchange, offers pieces of paper from a board game. It is a sweet gesture from a child, but it has zero actual economic value in the real world. In fact, the parent bought the board game for the child in the first place. The child is offering back a worthless fraction of what was already freely given to them. This highlights how ridiculous it is for human beings to think they can make an equal return to God for the benefits they have received. All that we have, including our very breath and any capacity to do good, comes from him.
That is a fantastic analogy. It perfectly illustrates the unbridgeable gap between us and God. Yet, as Owen notes in the text, another scholastic theologian named Gabriel tried to argue against this. Gabriel proposed that God does possess commutative justice by deciding to accept human actions as equal, even though they're clearly not.
Wait, let me make sure I'm following Gabriel's logic here. Is he saying that God basically agrees to treat our monopoly money as if it were real currency, and by doing so, God creates a system of commutative justice?
That is precisely his argument. Gabriel suggests that God voluntarily lowers his standard to accept our flawed, finite works as an equal exchange for his infinite grace. I love John Owen's reaction to this. In the text, Owen sarcastically replies to Gabriel's theory with the phrase, "Proudly enough said, indeed."
You can almost hear Owen rolling his eyes right through the text.
You really can. Owen sees right through it. This hits right at the heart of our Reformed theology. We completely reject any system of works righteousness. The idea that God lowers his standard of justice to accept our flawed, finite works as an equal exchange for grace is a direct insult to his holiness. It is a man-made attempt to put God in our debt, framing salvation as a wage earned rather than a gift freely given.
And if you think Gabriel's attempt to sneak works righteousness through the back door is bad, it actually gets worse. Owen moves on to address another thinker who practically tears the front door off its hinges.
Yes, Owen has very little patience for what he calls these triflers, and he quickly moves away from them to address a much more serious threat. This brings us to Francis Suarez. Suarez is an interesting historical figure because he actually did what Reformed thinkers might initially applaud. He rejected the confusing, convoluted philosophical arguments of the Schoolmen. He declared that the plain expressions of Scripture carried far more weight with him than scholastic philosophy.
Which sounds great at first. We always want to prioritize Scripture. But where does Suarez go off the rails?
He goes completely off the rails by introducing a massive theological error of his own making. While claiming to rely on Scripture, Suarez twisted the concepts of distributive and commutative justice to pave the way for the Roman Catholic doctrines of human merit and supererogation.
Let's define that term, supererogation, for you listening at home, because it is a very specific Catholic doctrine. Supererogation is the idea that the saints can perform actions that go above and beyond the call of duty. By doing these extra good works, they store up a surplus of extra merit. This surplus merit is then supposedly kept in a spiritual treasury and can be distributed to others who are lacking.
Right, and Suarez argued that an affection of punishing is inherent in God, but he manipulated the doctrine of justice to suggest that humans can actually satisfy God's punitive justice through their own actions. He proposed that through spontaneous submission to punishment or unprescribed penance, basically making yourself suffer in religious ways that God never commanded, you can pay off your own spiritual debt.
Owen calls this a sacrilegious and proud error, doesn't he?
He does call it that, and from a strictly Reformed perspective, it is easy to see why he uses such strong language. Suarez is trying to combine God's vindicatory justice with a absolute fiction about human beings performing penal satisfaction. He is claiming that your own self-imposed religious duties, your own physical suffering, or the surplus good works of departed saints can actually satisfy the divine justice required for your sins.
That is a staggering implication. If we accept Suarez's premise, we are basically saying Jesus did most of the heavy lifting on the cross, but he left the rest of the tab for us to pay off through our own religious suffering or good deeds. That completely guts the assurance of the believer. How could you ever know if you have performed enough penance? How could you ever know if your account is fully settled? You would be left in constant terror, wondering if you did enough to appease God.
And that terror is the inevitable result of abandoning the sufficiency of Christ. This is a direct affront to the finished work of Jesus Christ. If human penance can satisfy divine justice, then Christ's atonement is no longer the sole sufficient mechanism for salvation. The blood of Christ, which the Apostle John says cleanses us from all sin, is suddenly treated as inadequate. It requires the supplement of human effort.
John Owen recognized the severe danger here, which is why he dismisses these thinkers as bunglers who know not the righteousness of God. He pivots away from their philosophical theories and turns his attention back to the sure word of prophecy, the scriptures. Here, Owen provides a biblical definition of universal justice, and this is where our conversation shifts from dismantling bad arguments to building up a true biblical framework.
That is right. According to Owen, universal justice is not some abstract rulebook that God has to consult before he acts. It is the absolute intrinsic rectitude and perfection of the divine nature. God's essence is most wise, most perfect, most excellent, and most merciful. That absolute perfection, considered in itself, is the justice of God.
How does that contrast with how the philosophers of Owen's day, or even the ancient philosophers, viewed justice?
It is a massive contrast. Owen draws a hard line between biblical justice and the definitions provided by men like Aristotle, Cicero, and the civilian lawyers. Aristotle and Cicero define justice in strictly human terms. They call justice a habit by which men are capable of doing just things, or an affection of the mind, giving to everyone his due. The civilians defined it as a constant and perpetual will to assign what is due.
Okay, I track with you on how humans view justice, but why does Owen argue that applying the definitions of Aristotle or Cicero to God is theological malpractice? What is the actual danger in saying God has a habit of justice?
I will gladly break down why assigning a habit or a material mode of operation to God is so problematic. In our adherence to the Westminster Confession, we understand the doctrine of divine simplicity. This means God is not made up of parts. He does not possess attributes the way a person possesses a coat or a skill set.
Could you give an example of how humans acquire habits, just to highlight the difference between us and God here?
Sure. You and I can acquire a habit. A person might not be naturally patient, but through discipline, practice, and enduring frustrating situations, they develop the habit of patience. Their patience is a quality added to their nature over time. Someone might learn to play the piano, and the ability to play is a habit added to them. God, however, is entirely self-existent and immutable. He does not acquire habits. He does not learn. He does not develop an affection of the mind that he did not previously possess.
So, to say God has a habit of justice implies that he had to practice being just.
Spot on. Or worse, it implies that there is a standard of justice existing outside of God, and God simply conforms to that external standard very well. That would mean the standard of justice is higher than God himself. Owen fiercely rejects this idea. He argues that God is a law unto himself. His very nature is the standard of all rectitude. He does not conform to justice. Justice is simply whatever aligns with his perfect nature.
That distinction is crucial for you to grasp. It means God is never looking up to a higher moral code. He is the moral code.
Because of this, God's universal justice directs all his operations. Whatever he decrees, whatever he does in providence, it is all an expression of his perfect rectitude. We see this scriptural grounding clearly. Owen points to Isaiah chapter 51, verse 6, where God is described as just in bringing salvation. Then in Romans chapter 3, verses 25 and 26, the Apostle Paul says God is just in pardoning sin. In Revelation chapter 16, verses 5 and 6, the angels declare that God is just in avenging and punishing sin.
So in every single action, whether he is saving, pardoning, or avenging, he is acting out of the absolute perfection of his own nature. That sets up a beautiful, cohesive reality. Every action God takes is a perfect expression of who he is. But this brings us to the main event of Owen's dissertation, the core controversy regarding what is called vindicatory or punitive justice. This is the specific justice by which God punishes the crimes of rational beings who have broken his law.
This is the battlefield Owen has been marching toward this entire time.
The monumental question is this. Is this punitive justice an essential attribute of God's nature, meaning he absolutely must exercise it if sin exists? Or is it simply a free act of his will, meaning he can choose to punish sin, or he can choose to just forgive it at his own pleasure? Let's look at the adversaries Owen was facing on this specific issue. First, there were the Socinians. Who were they, and what were they arguing?
The Socinians were part of a highly influential heretical movement led by men like Faustus Socinus, Crellius, and Ostrodius. The Socinians flatly denied that God has any attribute requiring satisfaction for sins. They claimed that God can simply yield up his claim of right.
What does that mean, to yield up his claim of right?
They viewed God like a human creditor. Think of a financial debt. If you owe me $100, I have the legal right to demand payment. But if I am feeling generous, I can just tear up the IOU. I can forgive the debt without anyone having to pay the $100. The Socinians applied this human financial concept to God and human sin. They said God is entirely free to just yield his right and forgive without demanding satisfaction. To them, divine justice was not an absolute necessity. They reduced it to mere anger or fury, which are emotions that God could freely choose to switch off.
It makes God sound like a landlord who just decides not to collect rent this month. But what makes this historical situation so tragic is that Owen was not just fighting the Socinian heretics on this front, he was also dealing with friendly fire from within his own theological camp, right?
Yes, the friendly fire aspect is one of the most fascinating elements of this theological dispute. Owen specifically points out Samuel Rutherford. Rutherford was a Scottish divine whom Owen held in very high regard. Rutherford was thoroughly orthodox in his belief that Christ actually did provide satisfaction for sins. He believed in the cross. However, Rutherford agreed with the Socinians on the underlying mechanism.
How so? Where did Rutherford agree with them?
Rutherford argued that punitive justice is a free act of the divine will. He believed God decreed to punish sin, and because he decreed it, it happened. But Rutherford denied that God's nature necessarily demanded it. He thought God could have chosen another way, but simply opted for the cross.
Owen looks at this and realizes that by conceding this philosophical point to the Socinians, Orthodox theologians like Rutherford were handing over their strongest defense for the necessity of the cross.
Precisely. Let us systematically dismantle the idea that God could pardon sin by a mere nod or breath without Christ's satisfaction. If you argue that God's justice does not necessarily require the punishment of sin, you are essentially saying that sin and no sin are the exact same to God, apart from his free choice to care about it.
That is a terrifying thought. If God could have just spoken a word of forgiveness, if he could have just pardoned humanity with a simple nod of his head, then we must look at the Garden of Gethsemane in a completely different light. Think about Jesus sweating drops of blood, begging the Father, saying, "If it is possible, let this cup pass from me." The Father said no. But if the Socinians, or even Rutherford, are right, the Father could have said, "You know what? Never mind. I will just yield my right to punish. You do not have to go to the cross."
That is the exact logical conclusion. If God could have forgiven us without a penalty, then the crucifixion was not a divine requirement for salvation. It was an unnecessary tragedy. It turns the brutal, bloody sacrifice of the Son of God into an arbitrary display rather than the indispensable, necessary act that secured our redemption.
I want you listening to sit with that thought for a moment. It completely changes how you read the Gospels. If the cross was optional, if God had other ways to forgive but chose the most agonizing death for his Son anyway, it paints a horrifying picture of the Father. It makes him look cruel. John Owen saw this clearly. He realized that if you lose the absolute necessity of punitive justice, the entire Christian faith is left defenseless against critics.
To solve this problem and defend the cross, Owen introduces some masterful theological distinctions. He breaks down the mechanics of God's attributes, specifically drawing a line between attributes that require an object to exist beforehand and attributes that do not.
Okay, let's walk through that slowly. What is the difference between a free attribute and a necessary attribute in God?
Owen uses wisdom and omnipotence as examples of attributes that are completely free in their first exercise. Think about the creation of the world. God was not forced by his nature to create the universe. He existed in perfect, eternal fellowship within the Trinity. He was totally free to create a world or not create a world. His wisdom and power did not require an external object to exist in order for God to be God.
So he is freely exercising his power to create. He did not have to.
Right. However, punitive justice is entirely different. Punitive justice requires the existence of a rational, sinning creature. You cannot punish a rock, and you cannot punish an innocent being. The object, which is a sinner, must exist first. Owen makes the brilliant argument that while God was free to create or not create, once he freely chose to create a rational creature, and once that creature chose to sin, God's nature necessitates a response.
To clarify this distinction, Owen uses an incredible analogy regarding the truthfulness of God, does he not? He calls it the speaking truth analogy. Can you unpack that for us?
It is one of his best illustrations. Consider God's ability to communicate. God is completely free to choose whether or not he speaks to human beings. There is no law in the universe that forces the Almighty to utter a single word to us. He could have remained silent forever. However, if God freely chooses to speak, he must speak the truth. He cannot lie, because lying violates his intrinsic nature.
So he acts freely in choosing to speak, but he acts necessarily in speaking truthfully.
Precisely. Owen applies this exact same logic to punitive justice. God was entirely free to create humanity. He was free to establish a moral law. But having freely created them and having established their moral dependence on him, if those creatures sin, God must punish that sin. He cannot simply ignore it, just as he cannot speak a lie. Overlooking sin would violate his intrinsic holiness and his supreme right as the ruler of the universe. He acts freely in creation, but he acts necessarily in his justice toward rebellion.
That makes so much sense. It perfectly balances God's sovereignty with his holy nature. But this brings up a question about mercy. If God has to exercise justice when a creature sins, why does he not have to exercise mercy? What is the critical difference between how God exercises justice versus how he exercises mercy?
Owen points out that between an act of mercy and its object, there is no natural obligation. God is not bound to show mercy to anyone. Think about fallen angels. God did not provide a savior for demons. He showed them no mercy, and he remains perfectly just. If he were bound to show mercy, it would not be mercy anymore. It would be a debt.
That is a massive point. Mercy, by definition, has to be unmerited.
Correct. But between an act of justice and its object, a natural obligation intervenes. Because the creature is entirely subordinate to God, a failure in obedience demands a consequence to preserve God's dominion. Mercy is entirely free. Justice is a necessary consequence of his holiness encountering human rebellion.
That distinction between mercy and justice is the bedrock of Reformed theology. It destroys the argument that God is somehow unfair if he does not save everyone. He owes us nothing but justice. Any mercy he gives is an entirely free, unmerited gift. But this leads us to ask about the mechanics. How is this necessary justice actually applied? If God must punish sin, does he do it in a blind rage? Does he punish to the utmost extent of his absolute capability?
John Owen argues no. He clarifies that God does not punish to the maximum of his absolute capability, but rather he punishes according to the standard of his right and his infinite wisdom. Owen details the mechanics of divine punishment by looking at what he calls the first egress of justice.
The first egress, what does that look like practically?
The first step, the first outward expression of this justice was the creation of a penal law, a law that says if you do this, you will die.
Why was a penal law necessary in the first place? Could God not just rule without one?
Owen argues that without a law attaching a penalty to disobedience, God would lose his natural dominion over his creatures. If a creature can rebel against the Creator without any consequence, the Creator is no longer in charge. The moral universe would collapse into total anarchy. By establishing a law with a penalty, God preserves his right as the supreme governor.
Okay, I follow that. The law establishes God's rule. But if the law demands punishment and I broke the law, am I not doomed? Where is the good news in this framework? This is where Owen introduces what we might call the loophole of grace, is it not?
It is the most beautiful, breathtaking part of Owen's entire argument. Owen states that God's justice necessarily respects punishment in general. Let me explain what that means. Justice requires the vindication of God's glory and the preservation of his right. The penalty of the law must be executed. The law says, the soul who sins shall die. Justice requires a death.
Right, blood must be shed.
But, and this is the crucial point, this necessary justice does not mandate the specific time of the punishment, the specific degree of the punishment, or even the specific species of punishment for the individual sinner.
Wait, run that by me one more time. Justice demands punishment, but it does not demand that the specific sinner has to be the one to bear it.
That specific formulation is the absolute genius of John Owen, and it is the hinge upon which our salvation swings. Listen closely to what Owen is doing here. The Socinians argued that if justice is strictly necessary, then every individual sinner must be eternally punished, leaving no room for grace at all. They said, if God has to punish, then everyone goes to hell.
Which is a terrifying, though logically consistent argument if you do not have Owen's distinction.
Exactly. Owen counters this by defining accurately what justice requires. Because the requirement is for punishment in general, to uphold the moral order of the universe and vindicate God's majesty, it leaves the door wide open for a substitute. It leaves the door open for vicarious punishment.
Vicarious punishment, meaning someone else taking the hit.
Yes, God's nature demands that the blow must fall, but his infinite wisdom provides a way for the blow to fall on someone else. This is where the theology of the cross is fully secured. If justice demanded that the specific individual who committed the crime must be the one to suffer, we would all be lost. But because justice demands the vindication of God's honor through a sufficient penalty, Christ can step into our place.
That is just incredible. Jesus Christ, being infinite in value, takes the blow on our behalf.
He bears the wrath that was entirely necessary. God does not sweep the sin under the rug. He did not yield his claim of right with a simple nod, like the Socinians claimed. He executes his necessary justice fully, violently, and completely upon his own Son. Therefore, at the cross, God is both perfectly just because every single sin was punished, and the perfect justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus, because the sinner is set free.
That is the gospel in its purest, most robust form. When you grasp what John Owen is teaching here, your entire perspective on the Christian faith becomes anchored in concrete reality. We have covered an immense amount of theological ground today, tracing the arguments from the scholastic errors of the Schoolmen, looking at Durandus and Gabriel. We walked through the dangerous compromises of Suarez and his Catholic doctrines of supererogation, and we even looked at the friendly fire from Rutherford. We have taken all of that and seen how Owen builds an airtight defense of God's vindicatory justice.
And we have seen how understanding this justice as an absolute necessity of God's nature is the only way to secure the reformed view of the atonement. It secures your assurance as a believer. You do not have to wonder if you have done enough penance, like Suarez suggested. You do not have to worry if God's forgiveness is just an arbitrary mood swing that he might reverse tomorrow. The necessary justice of God was fully satisfied by the vicarious punishment of Jesus Christ.
The debt is paid in full, not with monopoly money, but with the precious blood of the Son of God. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you listening with a final concept to ponder, something that builds on this text but stretches your thoughts even further for the rest of your week. If God's punitive justice is as essential and unchangeable as his absolute truthfulness, meaning he literally could not just sweep your sin under the rug to save you, how does that shift the way you perceive the sheer magnitude of his love? Knowing that he could not ignore the law, but rather chose to absorb the catastrophic blow of his own necessary justice within himself, how does that alter your daily gratitude? He did not spare himself to spare you. Keep pressing into these hard theological truths. They are the bedrock of a robust faith. Thank you for joining us on Reformed Thinking. We will see you next time.
Farewell, and keep studying the Word.